The dust of FOB Kestrel tasted of rust and altitude. It was a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into everything: weapon mechanisms, sealed rations, the folds of a soldier's skin. Sergeant Eva Rostova felt it on her teeth as she stepped off the Osprey, the twin rotors churning the thin mountain air into a violent, ochre storm. She cinched the collar of her uniform, her gaze sweeping the perimeter. The base was a scar gouged into the armpit of a jagged mountain range, a desperate clawhold in a land that wanted nothing more than to shrug it off. She was not a large woman. Her frame was lean, economical, built for endurance rather than brute force. Her face was a composite of hard planes and sharp angles, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, regulation bun. There were no soft curves, no concessions to conventional prettiness. A thin, silvery scar cut from the corner of her left eye to her jawline, a relic that pulled the skin just enough to give her a perpetually serious, almost dour expression. It was a face that men either ignored or dismissed. Today they did both. A group of infantrymen, lean and hard-bitten from months in the high desert, watched her approach. They lounged against a stack of sandbags, their rifles held with a lazy familiarity that spoke of constant readiness. Their leader, a lieutenant with the new-coined brightness of a recent academy graduate, stepped forward, his nameplate red Vance. "Quartermaster Sergeant Rostova?" he asked, his tone laced with a theatrical politeness that was more insulting than open hostility. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged, her voice low and even, carrying no more inflection than necessary. She handed him a datapad. "My orders. I'm here to conduct a full audit of the depot and streamline your supply chain." The lieutenant, Kalen Vance, gave the datapad a cursory glance before passing it to the mountain of a man beside him. Sergeant Rex Galanis, callsign Wrecker, took it with a smirk. His neck was as thick as Rostova's thigh, and his arms were a tapestry of faded, aggressive tattoos. He grunted, his eyes flicking from the screen to Rostova and back again. "Streamline," Galanis echoed, drawing the word out. "Right? Because what this shithole really needs is another rear-echelon pencil pusher telling us how to stack our beans and bullets." A few of the younger soldiers chuckled. Rostova's expression didn't change. She met Galanis's mocking gaze, her own dark eyes unblinking, patient, like a geologist studying a rock. "My job is to ensure you have what you need, Sergeant, and to identify logistical vulnerabilities before the enemy does." "Vulnerabilities?" Vance scoffed, taking the datapad back. "Sergeant, this is the 75th. We are not vulnerable. We make other people vulnerable. You just count your crates and try not to get in the way." He gestured vaguely toward a cluster of prefabricated buildings. "Depot's over there. Colonel Thorne is expecting you for the morning brief in 30-inch. He turned his back on her, a clear gesture of dismissal. The group of soldiers broke up, their laughter carrying on the wind. One of them, a corporal named Diaz, cast a hesitant look back at her, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes before he was herded along by Galanis. They called her weak. They called her ugly. Rostova had heard it all before in a dozen different languages on a dozen different postings. The words were just noise, like the wind whistling through the razor wire. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked the weak points in the HESCO barriers, the inefficient placement of the secondary ammo cache too close to the fuel dump, the single, exposed communications tower on the ridge that was a sniper's invitation. They saw a plain woman with a clipboard and a quiet demeanor. They saw a clerk. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders, the weight of familiar comfort. She didn't need their welcome. She didn't need their approval. She was here to do a job. She walked toward the command post, her boots making soft, rhythmic crunching sounds in the gravel. The men of FOB Kestrel saw a quartermaster. They had no idea that a Kikimora had just been let into their house, and she was already finding it to be in a state of disastrous disorder. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of diesel and coming conflict, and Sergeant Rostova began her audit. She noted the lack of redundant power to the comms array, the way the primary medical station was situated on the outer perimeter, and the single, choked access road that served as their only artery for resupply or evacuation. She noted it all, her pen making small, precise marks on her datapad. Each mark was a premonition. The command tent was thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. A holographic map of the surrounding valleys shimmered in the center of the room, casting a blue pallor on the faces gathered around it. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood at the head, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains outside. He was old-school infantry, a commander who believed battles were won by grit and firepower, not by spreadsheets. He acknowledged Rostova's presence with a curt nod that was more of a twitch. "Sergeant, welcome to Kestrel. Find your corner. This is a tactical brief." Rostova took a position against the tent wall, silent and unobtrusive. She listened as the intel officer outlined the recent increase in enemy chatter. Lieutenant Vance followed, detailing his platoon's patrol schedules with a brash confidence that bordered on arrogance. He spoke of aggressive reconnaissance, of taking the fight to the enemy. "Our posture remains offensive," Vance concluded, his jaw set. "We'll keep them on their back foot. They won't dare a direct assault." Colonel Thorne nodded in approval. "Good. Proactive. I like it." He then turned, his eyes sweeping the room, and they landed on Rostova as if by accident. "Sergeant, you're here to look at our supplies. Anything to report?" The question was an afterthought, a box to be checked. Rostova stepped forward. The room's attention shifted to her, heavy with skepticism. Galenus, standing near the entrance, folded his massive arms. "Sir," she began, her voice steady, "I've completed a preliminary assessment. I have several urgent concerns." A low murmur went through the room. Vance's confident smirk tightened into a line of annoyance. "The primary ammunition depot is situated adjacent to the vehicle motor pool," Rostova stated, her gaze fixed on Thorne. "A single well-placed mortar or RPG could create a catastrophic secondary explosion, destroying our transport and our primary ordnance reserve simultaneously. I recommend dispersing at least 60% of the munitions to the secondary and tertiary caches, effective immediately." Thorne's brow furrowed. "The depot is where it is for efficiency, Sergeant. My men need to rearm and deploy fast, not go on a scavenger hunt. Speed is irrelevant if the supplies are gone, Colonel." Before Thorne could respond, she continued. "Furthermore, the comms array on Ridgeback Point is entirely dependent on a single generator with no hardened backup. The fuel lines are exposed. If we lose that tower, we lose long-range contact. We'd be blind and deaf." "We have redundant satellite phones," Vance interjected, unable to help himself. "Sat phones can be jammed, Lieutenant," Rostova countered without looking at him. "Especially if the enemy knows we're isolated. A hardline backup, or at least reinforced power conduits, is critical." She paused, letting the information settle before delivering her final point. "Lastly, our medical station. It's positioned on the western perimeter, the most likely vector of assault according to your own intelligence briefs. The first mortars that come over that wall will land on our surgeons and our blood supply." A heavy silence filled the tent. Rostova's points were logical, clinical, and stripped of any emotional appeal. They were also a direct critique of the base's entire defensive layout, a layout Thorne himself had approved. Galenus let out a short, derisive laugh from the doorway. "Sounds like she wants us to bury everything in the ground and fight with rocks." Colonel Thorne's jaw tightened. He looked at Rostova, his eyes cold. He saw a logistics sergeant, a non-combatant, questioning the judgment of seasoned warfighters. He saw bureaucracy impinging on the warrior ethos. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I appreciate your thoroughness. However, you are not a tactical officer. You are a quartermaster. Your job is to count what we have, not tell us how to use it. These men," he gestured to Vance and the others, "are the tip of the spear. Their efficiency of action is paramount. We will not hamstring our operational readiness based on hypothetical, worst-case scenarios from the supply corps." He turned back to the holographic map, a clear dismissal. "Your concerns are noted and filed. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a war to plan." The message was clear. She was an outsider, a clerk. Her counsel was unwelcome. Lieutenant Vance shot her a triumphant, condescending look. The other officers shuffled, avoiding her eyes. Rostova said nothing. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration. She simply gave a single, sharp nod. "Yes, sir." She turned and walked out of the command tent, back into the biting wind. As she walked, she pulled out her datapad. She didn't delete her report. Instead, she opened a new file, a private one. It was a contingency plan. She began mapping the locations of forgotten storage lockers, old construction crawlspaces, and sealed-off maintenance tunnels she had discovered on the original base schematics. Places not listed on any official inventory. Places nobody else knew existed. The men in the tent were planning a war based on the assets they thought they had. Sergeant Rostova began planning for a war fought with the assets they had forgotten. They had dismissed her warnings. Soon they would be praying she had a solution. The first mortar struck at 2:13. It wasn't a ranging shot. It was a statement. The shell impacted with surgical precision, not on the perimeter walls, but directly on the single, exposed generator powering the Ridgeback Point Communications Tower. The FOB was plunged into an eerie half-darkness as the main comms array and its associated floodlights died instantly. A moment of shocked silence. Then the sky ripped open. It wasn't a raid. It was a siege. A coordinated, intelligent, and brutal assault. A wave of disciplined fighters, not a disorganized militia, swarmed from the shadowed valleys. Mortars rained down, walking a path not toward the barracks, but along the western perimeter, directly toward the medical station. The first screams were not of defiance, but of wounded medics. Inside the command post, chaos erupted. The holographic map flickered and died. Backup generators kicked in, but the long-range comms were gone. Static hissed from every channel. Vance's confident voice was tight with disbelief over the platoon radio. "They're jamming us. Full spectrum. Where the hell did they get that tech?" Colonel Thorne, his face grim in the red glow of emergency lighting, barked orders. "All units, defensive positions. Return fire. Wrecker, get your squad to the west wall. Shore it up." Then came the second impact, the one Rostova had foretold. A guided missile, not a simple RPG, streaked from the darkness and slammed into the side of the main ammunition depot. The initial blast was deafening, but it was the secondary explosion that broke the base's spine. With a cataclysmic roar, thousands of rounds of ammunition, grenades, and mortar shells cooked off at once. The adjacent motor pool, full of fueled Humvees and transport trucks, vanished in a blossoming fireball that lit the mountains like a false dawn. The shockwave hit the command tent like a physical blow, shredding the canvas and sending men flying. Shrapnel, twisted metal from the Humvees, scythed through the air. Colonel Thorne cried out, clutching his arm as a piece of jagged steel buried itself in his bicep. The elite soldiers of the 75th, trained for aggressive offensive action, were now trapped in a crumbling fortress, their mobility gone, their primary ammo source a crater of fire, and their command structure in disarray. Their well-laid plans, built on the assumption of their own superiority, had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Panic began to set in. On the west wall, Galenus's squad was pinned down, taking heavy casualties and burning through ammunition at an alarming rate. "Command, this is Wrecker. We're getting chewed up. They've got machine gun nests in the rocks. We can't suppress them. We need more 556. Repeat, we are running dry." "Negative, Wrecker. The depot is gone." Vance's voice crackled, strained. "Conserve what you have. Conserve." Galenus roared back. "They're coming over the goddamn walls." Corporal Diaz, crouched beside Galenus, fumbled with a magazine, his hands shaking. He saw the enemy moving with a terrifying discipline, using fire and maneuver, flanking them, hurting them. They weren't fighting insurgents. They were fighting soldiers. The FOB had become a kill box. The initial confidence of Thorne's men curdled into desperation. Their training hadn't prepared them for this. To be the nail, not the hammer. They were isolated, bleeding, and running out of everything. The vulnerabilities Rostova had outlined with quiet precision were no longer hypothetical. They were gaping, fatal wounds, and FOB Kestrel was bleeding out. In the midst of the carnage, a figure moved with an unnatural calm. Sergeant Eva Rostova was not in cover. She wasn't firing a weapon. She was moving through the smoke and chaos with a singular, unhurried purpose. While others scrambled for cover from the incoming fire, she seemed to flow between it, her path economical, her eyes missing nothing. She found the mess chief, a grizzled sergeant named Patterson, huddled with two young cooks behind a blasted concrete barrier. They were terrified. "Patterson!" Rostova's voice cut through their fear, low and direct. "On your feet. You and your men are with me." "Sergeant, we're cooks," one of them stammered. "Today, your logistics," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She handed Patterson a pry bar. "Follow me. Move." She led them not toward the fighting, but away from it, into the skeletal remains of a building marked for demolition. It wasn't on any current map. She stopped at a section of concrete floor that looked no different from the rest. "Here," she pointed. "Pry." Confused but compelled by her certainty, Patterson and his men went to work. Beneath a layer of dust and debris, they found the edges of a concealed steel plate. It took their combined effort to heave it open, revealing a dark, dusty crawlspace. Inside, stacked in neat, vacuum-sealed rows, were dozens of crates. Ammunition: 556 mm, 762 mm, and 40 mm grenades, Rostova stated, shining a light into the darkness. This was an old CO's private stash from 3 rotations ago. Never logged in the central inventory, she looked at the cooks. "Get it to the west wall. Use the storm drains for cover. They run parallel to the perimeter." She gave them a route that was invisible from above, a route only someone who had studied the original blueprints would know. She left them to their task and continued her circuit. She found 2 mechanics near the burning motor pool, trying desperately to salvage equipment. She directed them to a sealed shipping container behind the defunct infirmary, one that was marked as contaminated medical waste. "It's not waste," she told them, handing them a pair of bolt cutters. "It's a field surgical kit, a blood bank, and 3 crates of morphine." The manifest was falsified by a supply sergeant trying to cover a paperwork error 2 years ago. "I found the discrepancy in the archives." She pointed to the relative safety of a hardened bunker near the center of the base. "Set up a triage there. Now." While the elite infantrymen were fighting a losing battle for their pre-planned positions, Rostova was rewriting the entire logistical map of the FOB. She was creating a new, decentralized, and resilient supply chain from the ghost inventory she had spent the last 24 hours unearthing. Her movements brought her near the battered command post. Thorne was on his back, a medic frantically trying to stop the bleeding in his arm. LT. Vance was now in command, and he was failing. He was throwing men at problems, trying to plug leaks with sheer aggression. "Second squad, push forward. Suppress that machine gun nest on the ridge," he yelled into the radio. "Negative, sir. They've got the angle on us. It's a suicide run." From the shadows, Rostova's voice emerged, calm and clear. "Lieutenant, you're sending them into a kill zone." Vance whirled around, his face slick with sweat and grime. "Rostova? What the hell are you doing here? Get to cover." "That machine gun nest is in a reinforced position," she said, ignoring his order. She pointed to a section of the ruined wall. "But the structure they're using is an old survey station. It has a critical flaw. The foundation is unstable on the eastern face." She turned to a nearby combat engineer who was staring at her, dumbfounded. Do you have 2 blocks of C4? The engineer nodded dumbly. "Place them at the base of that rock outcropping," she said, pointing to a spot 50 meters away from the nest itself. "The one that looks like a wedge. The shockwave will travel through the bedrock and collapse the entire position. It's a simple matter of sympathetic detonation." Vance stared at her, his mouth agape. That's insane." "It's physics, Lieutenant," she replied. "It will work." The engineer looked from Rostova's unwavering eyes to Vance's frantic ones. He made his choice. On my way. Minutes later, a controlled, muffled thud echoed from the ridge, followed by the grinding sound of rock and concrete giving way. The relentless chatter of the enemy machine gun ceased abruptly. A cheer went up from the beleaguered second squad. Vance looked at Rostova, his arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by raw disbelief. Before he could speak, a frantic call came over the radio. It was Galenus. Command, I've got enemy sappers on me. They're at the base of the last comms relay. We're out of ammo. We can't stop them. Diaz is hit. I'm out of ammo. This was it. The final link. If the relay fell, they would have no way to even broadcast a local distress signal. They would be utterly alone. Without a word, Rostova turned. She scanned the battlefield and saw a fallen soldier, his rifle lying beside him. She moved toward it, her pace quickening. She scooped up the M4, checked the magazine, and slapped the bolt forward with a practiced, fluid motion that was shockingly out of place for a quartermaster. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She moved with the lethal grace of a predator. She found a stable firing position behind a shattered Jersey barrier, a clear line of sight to the relay tower 200 meters away. 3 figures were visible in the strobing light of the fires, working frantically at its base. Corporal Diaz was on the ground nearby, bleeding from the leg, his rifle fallen from his grasp. He watched in a daze as the plain-faced supply sergeant, the woman they'd all laughed at, brought the weapon to her shoulder. Her posture was perfect. Her breathing was controlled. The world seemed to slow down. She didn't spray. She didn't fire in bursts. The rifle cracked once. The first sapper holding a charge dropped. A second of hesitation from the other 2. It was all she needed. The rifle cracked again. The second sapper, the one providing cover, slumped over. The third turned to run. The rifle cracked a final time. He fell forward, face down in the dirt. 3 shots, 3 kills. A distance of 200 meters at night under fire with a standard-issue rifle and iron sights. It wasn't just good shooting. It was impossible shooting. Galenus, who had been preparing to make a final, suicidal charge with his combat knife, stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the 3 bodies, then back at the slight figure behind the barrier. Rostova lowered the rifle. She ejected the spent magazine and calmly retrieved a fresh one from the fallen soldier's vest, seating it with a firm click. The chaos of the battle raged on, but in that small sector, there was a pocket of stunned, absolute silence. The woman they had called a clerk had just saved them all, and she had done it with the cold, terrifying efficiency of a master. In the gray, pre-dawn light, the fighting subsided. The enemy, having failed to break the base in their initial shock and awe assault, had pulled back into the mountains, leaving their dead behind. The survivors of FOB Kestrel moved like ghosts through the wreckage, tending to the wounded, counting the dead, and staring at the scale of the destruction. The base had held, but only just. It was a victory that felt precariously like a defeat. Lieutenant Vance found Sergeant Rostova near the comms relay she had saved. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't resting. She was methodically field-stripping the M4 she had used, cleaning each component with a small rag and a bottle of CLP she had produced from one of her pouches. The movements of her hands were precise, hypnotic, a ritual performed 1,000 times before. The weapon was already immaculate. Vance stopped a few feet away, his own rifle hanging limply from its sling. He was covered in filth, his uniform torn, his face a mask of exhaustion and awe. He watched her for a long moment, the quiet clicks of the weapon's parts being the only sound between them. The engineer, the one you told to blow the foundation, he said you called it sympathetic detonation. Vance began, his voice raspy. That's a breacher's term. An SF term. He took a hesitant step closer. Those 3 shots, 200 meters, in the dark. That's not something you learn in quartermaster school. Rostova paused her work. She looked up at him, her dark eyes giving nothing away. The scar on her cheek seemed more prominent in the pale light. "Who are you, Sergeant?" Vance asked, the question raw with a desperate need to understand. Before she could answer, another figure approached, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale but his eyes sharp. It was Colonel Thorne. He had heard Vance's question. He didn't look at the lieutenant. His gaze was fixed on Rostova and the disassembled rifle in her hands. "I think I have an answer to that, Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice gravelly. He held up a datapad, its screen cracked but functional. "When the relay came back online, the first thing I did was pull Sergeant Rostova's full and censored service record. It took my command-level clearance and a priority request that probably set off alarms all the way back at CENTCOM." He turned the screen so Vance could see it. Most of the file was a wall of black, redacted lines. A career shrouded in classification. But Thorne had managed to unencrypt a single crucial entry. It was a course certification from years ago, a school that only a select few in the entire military were ever chosen for. "Graduate?" Thorne read aloud, his voice heavy with disbelief and newfound respect. "Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Sodik." He looked from the screen to Rostova. "That's the Army's advanced sniper school. The one they send Green Berets and Rangers to." He paused, then read the last line, the one that made everything click into place. "Assigned call sign, Kikimora." The name hung in the air. Vance didn't understand. But Galenus, who had limped over to join them, his own awe silencing his usual bluster, did. He'd heard the term from a Chechen fighter he'd interrogated years ago. "Kikimora," Galenus whispered, his voice hoarse. "A house spirit." From the old Slavic tales, he looked at Rostova, a dawning, terrifying realization on his face. "They said it's a spirit that lives in the dark corners of a house. It's quiet. You never see it. But if you don't keep your house in order, if you're lazy or arrogant, it brings misfortune. It punishes you." The pieces fell into place with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a supply clerk. She wasn't just a quartermaster. Her audit wasn't about beans and bullets. It was about assessing their readiness, their competence, their order. She was an observer, a ghost placed in the system with a lethal skill set held in deep reserve. The logistics role was the perfect cover. A position that gave her access to everything, but a status that made her invisible, underestimated by men like them. They had mocked the house spirit. They had dismissed her warnings. And when their house began to crumble, she was the one who emerged from the shadows to violently, efficiently, and dispassionately put it back in order. Rostova finished reassembling the rifle. The final click as the receiver locked into place was unervingly loud in the quiet dawn. She didn't acknowledge their discovery. She didn't need to. She stood up, the rifle held loosely in one hand, and looked out over the broken FOB. Her house was, for the moment, secure. A week later, the sky above FOB Kestrel was once again filled with the sound of rotors. But this time they were not an omen of attack. A trio of Black Hawks descended, carrying a delegation from Regional Command. At their head was General Abramson, a four-star officer whose presence alone signified the gravity of what had happened here. The surviving personnel of the FOB were assembled on the makeshift parade ground, a patch of gravel that had been cleared of debris. They stood in loose formation, their uniforms still bearing the stains and tears of the battle. They were not the same men who had stood here a week ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a somber, hard-won maturity. General Abramson, a tall man with a face that looked like it had been hewn from oak, moved down the line. He pinned a silver star on Colonel Thorne's chest for holding the command together despite his wounds. He awarded a bronze star with valor to a shaken but resolute Lieutenant Vance for his leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. He moved on to Galenus, Diaz, and the other infantrymen who had held the line, his aide handing him medal after medal. Sergeant Rostova stood where she always stood, at the back with the support staff. The cooks, the mechanics, the engineers. They were the ones who had kept the base alive, running ammunition through storm drains and setting up triage centers in bunkers, all under her quiet direction. They stood apart, accustomed to being overlooked when the brass and the medals came out. The general finished with the last infantryman. The ceremony, it seemed, was over. He took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers. Colonel Thorne prepared to give the order to dismiss the formation. But the general didn't turn away. Instead, he turned his body 90 degrees. His eyes scanned past the decorated combat soldiers, past the officers, searching for someone in the back. His gaze locked onto Sergeant Rostova. A hush fell over the entire base. Every eye followed the general's. Slowly, deliberately, General Abramson began to walk. He walked past Thorne. He walked past Vance. He walked through the ranks of the elite infantrymen, their newly pinned medals glinting in the harsh sunlight. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of the quiet quartermaster sergeant. He stood before her, the four-star general and the supply sergeant with the scarred face. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression one of profound, unequivocal respect. Then, with a motion that was slow, precise, and heavy with meaning, he raised his hand to his brow and rendered a perfect, formal salute. He held it, the silence stretched, thick and absolute. Colonel Thorne, watching this incredible breach of protocol, felt a jolt run through him. He understood. He barked an order, his voice cracking with emotion. "Attention!" Every soldier on the parade ground snapped to the position of attention. Thorne, his good arm moving with rigid precision, raised his own hand and saluted not the general, but Sergeant Rostova. Seeing their commander's action, a wave of understanding and shame and awe rippled through the formation. Lieutenant Vance's hand came up, his salute sharp, his eyes locked on the woman he had dismissed as a pencil pusher. Sergeant Gallinus, the man who had called her weak and ugly, saluted her, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a reverence he had previously reserved only for fallen heroes. Corporal Diaz, the engineers, the medics, every single survivor on FOB Kestrel saluted her. They held the salute, a silent, unified chorus of respect, directed at the unassuming woman at the back of the formation. Sergeant Eva Rostova did not smile. She did not show any flicker of triumph or vindication. Her expression remained as stoic and unreadable as ever. With the same crisp, economical precision she used to clean a rifle, she raised her hand and returned the general's salute. In the silent mountains of a foreign land, the house had been put in order. Respect had been paid. That night, the mess hall was loud. There was beer, stories being retold with exaggerated bravado, and the cathartic release of men who had walked through hell and come out the other side. It was a celebration of survival. But Sergeant Rostova was not there. Her sanctuary was the cavernous, half-empty supply depot. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that danced between the tall metal shelves. The air smelled of canvas, oil, and cold steel. She was alone, seated on an overturned crate, the M4 from the battle laid across her lap on an oil-stained cloth. She was not cleaning it. It was already perfect. This was something else. A ritual. Her hands moved over the weapon with a slow, deliberate tenderness, checking the tension of the springs, testing the seating of the pins, wiping down the stock. It was a quiet communion, a way of centering herself in a world of chaos. The rhythmic, metallic clicks were a language only she understood. It was the sound of order, of control, of deadly purpose. The large bay door creaked open a few inches, letting in a sliver of the noisy night from outside. Corporal Diaz stood silhouetted in the opening, hesitant. He held a steaming metal mug in his hands. He had watched her from afar all evening, seeing her slip away from the celebration. He had felt a pull, a need to acknowledge what she had done in a way that speeches and medals could not. He stepped inside. The sounds of his boots on the concrete floor seemed loud in the stillness. Rostova didn't look up, but her hands stilled their motion. She knew he was there. Diaz walked quietly to her side. He didn't speak of the battle. He didn't thank her for saving his life. He didn't mention the impossible shots she had made. The gulf between what he was and what she was felt too vast for such words. "Sergeant," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you might want some coffee." He held out the mug. It was black, no sugar, no cream. He'd guessed. He placed it carefully on a sturdy wooden crate next to her, making sure it was stable. It was a small offering, a simple gesture of respect from a soldier to a warrior. Rostova finally looked up from the rifle. Her gaze moved from the weapon to the steaming mug and then to his face. For the first time since she had arrived, the hardness in her eyes seemed to soften, just for a fraction of a second. The perpetual tension in her jaw eased. She gave a single, small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was everything. Diaz nodded back, a wave of relief washing over him. He had done the right thing. He turned and walked away, leaving her to her solitude, closing the door softly behind him. Sergeant Eva Rostova watched him go. She looked at the mug of coffee, the steam rising from it like a prayer in the cold air. Then she looked back at the rifle in her hands. She picked up the coffee, the warmth spreading through her fingers, and took a slow sip. The quiet, rhythmic work of maintaining her tools resumed, a silent watch in the heart of the mountains. The Kikimora was at peace. Her house was in order,